Hi, everybody. Welcome.
I guess not.
Welcome. I'm Viveca Morris. I'm the Executive Director of the Law, Environment, and Animals program at Yale Law School. And before we introduce our wonderful speaker today, a few notes. Please be aware that this event is being recorded. Please help yourself, if you haven't already, to lunch in the back, all of which is vegan, including the cookies. There will be time for a Q&A at the end of this talk, so please hold your questions until the end. And then lastly, thank you very much to today's co-sponsors for this event, which include Plant Forward Yaleys, the Yale Animal Law Society, the Yale Environmental Law Association, and the Yale Sustainable Food Program. With that, I am so delighted to get to introduce you all to Lingxi Chenyang. Lingxi is an associate professor of law at University of Utah's College of Law, where her research interests lie at the intersection of moral psychology, climate ethics, environmental law, food law, and property law. Originally from Chengdu, China, Lingxi graduated from Yale Law School with a JD and the University of Michigan with a PhD in philosophy. She will be speaking today on some of her recent research, which explores the historical and political context behind the Farm Bill, sheds light on our food system, and suggests potential pathways for reform. She's a tremendously thoughtful scholar and a rising star and an alum of our program. We like to count her as such, who we're tremendously proud of. So we're so pleased and grateful that she's back today. And with that, welcome, Professor Chenyang.
Thanks, Viveca. I'm so happy to be back at YLS. Thank you, Viveca and Doug, for inviting me. I just want to say LEAP was a real highlight of my time in law school, and I'm glad to see it thriving. So this project is about the history of the Farm Bill, and it's called Food Anti-Democracy. The paper is forthcoming in the Southern California Law Review, but it's still a draft in progress, so any feedback at this stage would be welcome. So my main argument in the paper is that our centerpiece federal food law is anti-democratic in both substance and procedure. And what I mean by this is that it originated during the New Deal to help wealthy commodity farmers, primarily at the expense of smaller farmers, consumers, and the environment. And when the public caught on, federal administrators began this massive propaganda campaign to persuade the public that farm subsidies are actually intended for everyone's benefit. And the effectiveness of this propaganda campaign is partly why I think the Farm Bill has not fundamentally changed in the last century at the expense of interests like environmental protection and animal welfare. And specifically, the Roosevelt administration, under which the first farm bills were passed, I argue made three arguments for the existence of the Farm Bill, right? So first, it affords food relief for the poor. Second, that it's a method of protecting the soil conservation. And third, that it helps stabilize food prices. I wanted to first start with what motivated this project, all the problems with our food system. So this is a satellite image of the dead zone in the Gulf. I grew up in a barrier island off the coast of Texas called Galveston, and the ocean close to where I live always smelled disgusting. It was probably not a fun place to spend a weekend. And I would learn when I got older that this was caused by nitrogen fertilizer, which was applied continue to be applied to row crops in the Midwest, far up the Mississippi River, which feeds into the Gulf. The excess fertilizer leaches off into the soil and goes in the Mississippi River and spills out into the Gulf. That feeds algae, which then die and depletes dissolved oxygen in the water, which kills fish and marine life, which explains the smells I experienced as a kid. Currently, the dead zone is the size of New Jersey and growing, and the water pollution caused by agriculture is functionally unregulated under the Clean Water Act, which is our centerpiece federal water pollution law. So fast forward 20 years to the state of Utah, where I now live. The problem is water depletion instead of water pollution. So these are pictures of the Great Salt Lake from the 80s and then taken in 2022. And as you can see, the Great Salt Lake has shrunken precipitously. The primary problem is, again, agriculture, specifically alfalfa farming, which primarily goes toward beef and dairy cow feed. Alfalfa uses somewhere between 50 to 60% of consumptive water use. which is the biggest contributor toward collapse, I think, of the Great Salt Lake. This is not to mention the global environmental impacts of agriculture. So the EPA estimates that agriculture contributes around 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Those are just the direct emissions. So Nate Rosenberg at Harvard Law and Peter Lehner at Earth Justice came out with this paper in 2022, essentially estimating the actual emissions of ag in the U.S. is more like a third. So if you account for the higher global warming potential methane emissions from beef production and dairy production, as well as food waste, and also the opportunity cost of carbon sequestration from converting American forests into cropland, the total emissions of the food system is more like a third. If that's right, then agriculture contributes more to climate change than the transportation sector or the energy grid sort of individually. Ag emissions, unlike transportation and other industrial carbon emissions, are essentially unregulated under the Clean Air Act, our centerpiece air pollution law. And it gets worse. So the environmental costs of our food system are only eclipsed by the food system's human health costs. So the Rockefeller Foundation published a report in 2022 estimating that the U.S. food system exacts total external costs of $3.2 trillion per year. And it broke down these costs according to different categories: environment, biodiversity, health. As you can see, the bars under human health are much bigger than the ones under environment or biodiversity. So that's what they accounted for as the primary cost of the food system. These are public health care costs associated with diet-related diseases like diabetes from excess sugar consumption, heart disease and cancer from consumption of processed foods, etc. And of course, these costs are unevenly distributed. Southern states bear kind of the brunt of diet-related costs, as well as people of color. And so I had this question, why is our food system so messed up? Another piece of this puzzle is the Farm Bill. So as I mentioned, this is our centerpiece food and agricultural law. It's essentially a big spending bill that's passed every 5 to 6 years. The last one was passed in 2018, and that bill was projected to spend around $430 billion, or around $86 billion a year. 75% of the spending, as you can see in the pie chart, goes towards nutrition, and the majority of that goes towards SNAP benefits, otherwise known as food stamps. The rest fall into two broad categories. There are direct payments to farmers through crop insurance and commodity payments, and there are also direct payments to farmers through conservation spending. So that's a total of around $70 billion per year for nutrition and conservation. This should be surprising because, as I mentioned, the Rockefeller Foundation came out with this report saying the total external costs of the food system are $3.2 trillion. Much of this is in the form of environmental harms and public health costs. So something is not adding up. We're spending $70 billion per year for nutrition and conservation, but then spending $3.2 trillion on top of that in external costs. So this discrepancy is what motivated my project. And I wanted to see if the Farm Bill had anything to do with these problems. And to do this, I looked at all the farm bills that have been passed since the early 1900s, and I focused on the first 3 farm bills that were passed in the 1930s during what is called the New Deal era, and I wanted to know what did these bills do, and what were the kind of government rationales for these bills. So I went and looked at archival documents, internal memos, various documents from the Roosevelt administration to get a sense of why do we have a Farm Bill. So according to a conventional narrative, the government started paying farmers around this period to keep them in business. Why? Because people need to eat, and so farm subsidies help everyone by helping farmers. This narrative about the Farm Bill is repeated across the political aisle. This is Michael Pollan, McKnight Professor of Journalism at Berkeley and self-processed liberal, speaking on NPR, repeating this narrative about the Farm Bill that, to help the farmers who want to keep in business, we started paying them through the government. So let's start with the 1933 Farm Bill. So Pollan is right in that food prices did plummet in the 1930s. World War I had ended, the Great Depression hit, and demand for American food was at an all-time low. So as you can see, in the 30s, low commodity prices. This led to the passage of the first Farm Bill, which is a form of economic relief. And its architects were these two men and some others, but these are the two primary ones. They are what sociologist Jess Gilbert calls Midwestern farm boys turned academic economists. So we have the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, progressive, also owner of a successful seed business. We also have Rexford Tugwell, who was the Assistant Secretary of Ag. He was an economist at Columbia, and in his published writing, he had this vision for agriculture that it should be made up of the most efficient farmers, and the rest were to be absorbed in cities. So this was kind of his general approach to the farm crisis. There are too many farmers, right? They need to go into cities. So at their leadership, the first Farm Bill was passed. This was the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. This was a temporary measure, and it essentially instituted a system of government-led production control mechanisms. In other words, reduce the supply of food on the market and increase prices. Pretty simple economic rationale. So the government essentially paid farmers to grow fewer crops. Government payments were funded by a tax on agricultural processors, and this first bill was explicitly intended to benefit large commodity growers who constituted less than 10% of the population and a minority of farmers. So there were two problems with this initial Farm Bill. The first problem was that at the time that it was supposed to be implemented, this was the spring of 1933, livestock animals had already given birth. And specifically, millions of pigs around the country had given birth to litters of piglets. And the administration had this fear that the piglets will flood the market and subvert the price control purpose of the Farm Bill. And so the Roosevelt administration turned to the largest pig producers in the country for a solution, and they recommended just killing them. So this is what the administration did. It killed 6 million sows and piglets. 20% of the slaughtered pigs were used for food relief, but 80%, the vast majority of the slaughtered pigs were dumped in rivers, converted to fertilizer, and essentially used for non-food purposes. This made sense if the point of the bill was to reduce supply, right? It doesn't really matter where the excess supply goes as long as it's removed from the market. That will ensure an increase in prices. So this was the first issue. The second issue is that processors didn't like the plan. Ultimately, it was a bankrupt cotton processor who challenged these production controls as an unconstitutional encroachment on states' rights under the 10th Amendment, and he won a case called U.S. versus Butler. So this was the death of the first Farm Bill. The other problem, which I didn't mention, is that when people around the country learned about the pig slaughter, they had a massive backlash. So consumers thought the whole bill was morally unjust, for the pigs, for hungry consumers, for small farmers. This was a historical article about the public backlash at the time, and consumers complained that they didn't like the pigs were slaughtered for no reason, that they were being wasted, thrown away, and they threatened to vote Roosevelt out of office. This was kind of a political nightmare for the administration. So that led to the death of the first Farm Bill. Almost immediately after the pig slaughter debacle and U.S. versus Butler, which struck down the first Farm Bill, the administration helped pass the second Farm Bill. This was the this was the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act of 1936. This bill still had the aim of reestablishing the net income of farmers, so making farmers wealthier, but it added this new environmental goal to preserve and improve soil fertility. And the way that it purported to do this was it paid farmers to replace what it calls soil depleting commercial crops with soil improving practices. And the other change that the second bill made was that it changed the funding source. So farm payments would now come from the general treasury, so federal taxpayers, instead of taxes on processors. This was an obvious way of avoiding litigation. So taxpayers had no standing to challenge treasury appropriations. The Supreme Court had ruled that they could take to their representatives in Congress to change the outcomes of legislation. They can't sue in courts. The other reason that kind of soil conservation was the new heading for the second Farm Bill is that soil conservation was the cause celeb of the time. The Dust Bowl was on top of everyone's minds, partly because the USDA had paid filmmakers and photographers and artists to document the Dust Bowl in order to drum up support for New Deal natural resource conservation policies. So the left is a film still from a film about the Dust Bowl. It was funded by the USDA. It was watched in hundreds of classrooms and theaters across the country. The right is one that recognizes the migrant mother. Reportedly, it was the most reproduced photograph in the world. Dorothea Lange, the photographer, was hired by the USDA to take pictures of farmers in the Great Plains who looked, out on their luck. And the woman and her children in the picture are widely assumed to be one of these farming families, but actually they were staged by Lange. They weren't even from the Dust Bowl area. And the woman was not named in the photograph, and she was not compensated by Lange, and was later quite upset that her picture was made to be the icon of the Great Depression. So the USDA paid this photographer to take this picture and then promoted it across the country as an objective and representative record of Dust Bowl farm victims. Altogether, these images and films and stories created this narrative that farmers were kind of driven out and made destitute by the Dust Bowl, and they needed federal New Deal programs to save them from distress. President Roosevelt also stated upon signing of the second Farm Bill that the public needed to pay farmers to conserve soil if they wanted a steady supply of food, so linking the environmental rationale with the food security rationale. As I argue, that's not what the Farm Bill is really about. The primary clue is that the basic distinction that the legislation draws between soil depleting crops and soil conservation crops is just scientifically false. There's no such thing as a soil depleting crop. Hugh Bennett, the USDA's own soil scientist, in a government circular, said as much. Crops do not take away the soil, he writes. Rather, it's wind and water that causes soil erosion, and farmers can prevent soil erosion by planting trees. So the payment scheme was really production control in disguise to help commodity farmers by paying farmers to remove some of their crops from the market. The same thing the first Farm Bill did. And USDA's top economic advisor, Mordecai Ezekiel, admits as such in internal memos. He writes that there is no question that farm owners, who constitute less than half of all farmers in the country, are the primary beneficiaries of these programs. And this ran sort of contrary to this government narrative about poor farm tenants driven out by the Dust Bowl, this natural disaster, who needed New Deal programs to save them from distress. The second Farm Bill did not primarily target those farm tenants. There are two additional problems for the administration at the second stage. The first problem was that the public wasn't convinced. So newspapers were catching on to this soil conservation propaganda. They were reporting that the bill was really a giveaway for large farmers, masquerading as an environmental legislation. And the second problem was that the soil conservation bill was only temporary. This was still thought of as emergency the industry support in response to emergency market conditions. This ultimately led to the passage of the third Farm Bill. So this is the Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1938. This is a propaganda poster advertising it. And the main thing that the third Farm Bill did was that it implemented a permanent price floor for 6 commodities, so permanent farm subsidies. The challenge for the administration was to figure out a way to explain why they were making farm subsidies permanent. Remember, the last 2 farm bills had just implemented temporary payment schemes. And so the administration justified it by appealing to this concept of an ever-normal granary. You can see it in the small text in the picture. So this idea of the ever-normal granary was broadcast to the public by the administration and popular media and radio addresses and newspapers. Secretary Wallace went around to colleges and think tanks around the country personally to explain what the ever-normal granary was. So what the heck is it? So here's the basic idea behind the ever-normal granary. The government buys surplus foods during a good year to save farmers from low crop prices, and then during bad crop years, because of weather or other kind of natural uncontrollable forces, the government will sell store crops to prevent consumers from starving. So buy surpluses to help farmers, and then sell food during bad years to help consumers. Right. So this is essentially a price stabilization scheme. It ensured the public against unaffordable food, and it ensured farmers against a low income, right? So Wallace advertised this bill as sort of reciprocally or equally beneficial for farmers and consumers. He tells Bowdoin College, by husbanding supplies of fat years for use in lean years, the ever-normal granary proposes to shield farmers against ruinous surpluses and at the same time to give consumers assurance against famine. This idea also looked a lot like public utility regulation. So by the early 20th century, states had began regulating natural gas providers, electricity providers, telecommunications providers, and they did so by capping prices and tying into the cost of producing service. And the motivation behind public utility regulation was to prevent these companies who own these services from overcharging customers for what were thought of as essential services. And so this kind of interventionist agricultural policy looked a lot like public utility regulation. The problem was that despite this public-sounding, public utility-ish rationale, the Farm Bill primarily still benefited commodity farmers. The first problem was that while there was a commodity price floor in the legislation for 6 commodities, there was no reciprocal price ceiling to protect consumers from high prices. So if you look at the bill, you'll see there's a legislative floor for the foods, but no mechanism to release food or to kind of lower the price when those foods become too expensive. There's no such price cap in the 1938 Farm Bill or any farm bills that have since passed that ensures against unaffordable food for consumers. This is strange if the purpose of farm subsidies is to protect consumers and farmers alike. The second problem is that there was no consumer representation in administering the price stabilization plan, although in the bill, there was a robust procedure whereby farmers could vote to institute production controls to raise prices. So in place of consumer representation, Secretary Wallace created this public relations arm of the USDA called the Consumers Council, and he describes its purpose in this memo. The point of the Consumers Council was to justify the USDA's decisions before Congress and other political groups from the consumer's perspective. In reality, the Consumers Council played virtually no role in administering the Farm Bill. It was silenced by the administration every time they raised any kind of consumer-related concerns. One Consumers Council tried to publish reports about how farm subsidies affected food prices, which was quite a popular report, and that was eventually censored by the Department of Ag. And as a result, every appointed Consumers Council quit. So this is a memo from one of those Consumers Council sort of arguing that the point of the USDA is not in service of consumers. So this was as I mentioned, the third farm bill, and it really solidified later farm bills because it made subsidies permanent. And ultimately, this third farm bill was upheld in the case of Woodard v. Filburn, which some of you may have read about in constitutional law. So President Roosevelt threatened to pack the Supreme Court, and the new Supreme Court upheld the third farm bill as a form of constitutionally legitimate regulation of interstate commerce against this Midwestern farmer, small farmer, Filburn, who complained that he couldn't use his own wheat to feed his horses. And so that kind of cemented, I think, the shape and purpose and legality of the Farm Bill. So that's the story of how the Farm Bill started. I looked broadly at the approximately 20 farm bills that have passed between the 1930s and now. And I argue that none of the gaps between the original promises and reality of the original farm bills have been closed over the last 8 decades. There remains no consumer representation in the USDA. There are very few mandatory federal conditions on the disbursement of conservation funding. Commodity subsidies are not distributed in any way related to a nutritious domestic diet or any environmental goals. Perhaps the most democratizing change in the farm bills that have passed so far is the food stamp program, which was driven by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. There remain several problems with the food stamp program. It's constantly vulnerable to congressional cuts. Unlike commodity payments, which are permanently authorized under the 1938 Farm Bill and the 1942 Farm Bill. Food stamp benefits, SNAP benefits, are vulnerable to various legislative restrictions, many of which have nothing to do with nutrition, the broad title under which food stamps are allocated. So, for example, if you're on SNAP benefits, you can't buy hot soup. Not because hot soup is not nutritious, but because people, I think, on welfare are expected to work to prepare their own food. And there are a number of other sort of arbitrary restrictions like this within the SNAP program. So what are the implications of this story? I think there are two. The first is that I think propaganda plays a huge role in the effective capture of governmental bodies, as well as the persistence of this capture. So public choice theorists and political philosophers have sort of long known about the phenomenon of regulatory capture. That's when groups with high-stake interests in the outcome of a law or a policy, so regulated polluters and other industries, can focus their resources and energies to get the laws and policies they prefer. The theory of government capture predicts that those focused interest groups will win because the public's interest and the outcome are much lower stakes. So actually, in the Farm Bill story, the public seemed quite motivated to act and to kind of resist the first Farm Bill. Based on kind of self-interest, right? They didn't like high food prices, but also based on moral concerns about animal welfare, about food waste, about needless hunger. And it was really kind of a targeted propaganda campaign by the government that used sophisticated techniques, appealing to fancy-sounding economic concepts like the ever-normal greenery and emotion-laden art masquerading as documentary evidence that seemed to seal the fate of capture. So, in the absence of this propaganda, I wonder, would we have the farm bills that we do now? Of course, we now have a number of federal information disclosure laws that protects against government secrecy and misinformation. Among them is FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. And, I argue if the Farm Bill spending were not shielded from these laws, they could still function to sunshine the effects of Farm Bill spending and help counter these prevailing populist myths that it's kind of intended and functions to work in everyone's benefit. The second lesson from this story is that these promises that the first farm bills made, even if they were false propaganda and divorced from reality, they might offer a blueprint for democratizing the farm bill. I think there's a reason those myths have persisted. And one way to kind of reform the farm bill is simply to make good on those original promises, right? Kind of direct spending in favor of environmental protection, food security, nutrition, and small farmers.